Broadcasting live from our studio in Boston, Solutions Review is proud to showcase Monte Carlo and Snowflake in the Solution Spotlight, a unique online event for industry professionals.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome to the Solution Spotlight featuring Monte Carlo and focused on driving data warehouse cost optimization and performance. Nowadays, data and AI leaders are tasked to do more with less. More data products in less time, more strategic initiatives with less resources, more impact with less spend. The good news? There's a better and more efficient way to measure, optimize, and improve performance when using the Snowflake Data Cloud with Snowflake's capabilities and Monte Carlo data observability. So today, we're presenting a panel of experts on best practices for optimizing Snowflake query performance with cost governance, workload optimization, and Monte Carlo's new performance dashboard for query optimization across your Snowflake environment. And joining us from Monte Carlo, we have Michael Segner and Jesse Miller. And from Snowflake, we have Scott Redding, Senior Solutions Architect. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We love this topic. The idea of cost optimization, I think, is incredibly relevant right now. I think there are a lot of people who are very keen to hear what you guys have to say about this. So I'm going to try to get out of the way as soon as possible because I know there's a lot of ground to cover, and it's great that Monte Carlo has brought Snowflake into the conversation because they've got a certain philosophy and commitment to cost optimization as well. So this should be a really interesting topic. Before I get out of the way, however, I will let everybody know that we encourage interaction and certainly would welcome any questions that you have at any time during the program. Please send them along. I will field them here, and then I will funnel them over. I may actually do that in real time, or I may hang on to them and wait until the end. We'll kind of see what we get. But by all means, share whatever questions you might have, and we'll ask those at the end. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Michael, I think you're going to take the lead here as moderator, so I'll get out of the way, and I'll let you take over the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So I'm really excited for everyone who's with us here today. I think you made a really good choice. We're going to be learning some actual strategies, best practices from two of the best. Our format today is going to be pretty panel-style, conversational. We have some good questions queued up for our experts. If you have questions like Doug mentioned, feel free to definitely put them in the chat as you have them. Right. So let's really dive in here. Scott, I know we have a lot of Snowflake users and fans on this webinar today. I suspect we have some folks that are maybe considering migration or maybe just have a portion of their data in the cloud. So first off, how would you even describe the differences in what we mean by cost optimization from an on-prem world to a more modern data cloud?
Yeah, it's definitely a whole different world when you talk about the old on-prem world of costs where costs are more controlled, costs are sunk costs usually by the month versus moving to a more consumption-based model. It's something that people get, but it's hard to realize how it will work. And you tend to fall down with not having appropriate budgets for each industry, and you just let analysts fly around, querying as much as they want. It gets a little bit more difficult to be able to make sure you stay within the cost controls you want. So with Monte Carlo and a bunch of Snowflake features, I think is a lot of features you should be using to make sure you're staying within a budget versus before you were kind of just hard stuck on a budget for each month. So it's a different world.
And that wasn't necessarily a good thing, right? You were stuck on a budget because you had limited power. And now you kind of have a lot more fuel you can add to the fire if you need it. Jesse, curious, how do you think of this mindset shift when it comes to either cost optimization or data operations more broadly, when you're moving from that on-prem to the cloud?
Yeah, it's definitely a shift there because we're moving from talking about the things that go in mind is CapEx and then OpEx, kind of what those change as you move from the on-prem to kind of the cloud world. Kind of more visibility across things also comes into play, which is really beneficial as you're trying to get to that optimized state in the cloud. So these are things that we see across our customers as they kind of go through the shift, not only kind of getting that additional visibility there, but also kind of being able to kind of dial into where those opportunities are for like cost optimization. And of course, we see this, but I'm sure on the Snowflake side, it's quite prevalent as well. So.
Yeah, and speaking of the Snowflake side, the other thing I kind of want to tackle up front is, Snowflake has a lot of great tools around cost optimization. Scott, you're here today to talk about it. Why does Snowflake care about cost optimization to start with?
Yeah, I mean, to the point of being able to let people run wild, you have infinite scalability, right? It's the old Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility problem. A lot of developers used to be in the mindset of that fixed cost, right? And one of the benefits of Snowflake is the ramp up speed, right? So you can ramp up slowly, right? So you can limit people down to extra small warehouses that are very small, and then ramp up as you need to and scale in. Versus in the past, you used to do capacity planning every year, decide like, oh, how big does the server need to be next year, and all of this churn with internal IT people trying to figure this stuff out. Now you don't need that. You have scalability at your fingertips. You can just turn an extra large warehouse on if you need it. You can turn it off if you don't need it. So I think that's one of the huge benefits of Snowflake is being able to scale up and scale down as you need it. So in the past, you may be spending a ton of money on a huge server and you're not really using all of it. So you can go the reverse with Snowflake, where you can just use smaller warehouses and use exactly what you need, which is the huge benefit. There's tons of new features coming to Snowflake. There's a whole, in our Snowsite UI, there's a lot of cost management features coming down the line. There's tons of metadata you can use to do all the budgeting and allocation of costs that you want through our account usage views. So all the data is very easily sent back to you in tables that you can set up your own dashboards on. You can use tools like Monte Carlo to use that metadata to do cool things with. So it's really awesome.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things from my perspective is like when growing usage is tied to growing business value, it's a win for everybody long term, right? And that's kind of how I see this cost optimization discussion too. It's not always just about cutting, but about like linking usage to business value, which I think is something that every data team needs to get a little bit better about. That's not always something that's really easy to do. So, I mean, for example, Scott, like how would you even think of like an ROI of a pipeline, for example?
Yeah, for sure. I think, even now with very mature customers in Snowflake, I think they're not even thinking about this yet. But I think it will be the future. The most important thing is thinking about the entire ROI of a pipeline at the pipeline level. Usually in the past, you've thought about what is your business intelligence, the value of business intelligence and dashboards in general, when you're basically all sharing a sunk cost resource, things like that. So nowadays, I think the actual pipelines to build the actual data that you need for a certain use case, you can almost see that end to end at the query level with almost at the query level cost, and figure out exactly how much money it's costing you to build that data to deliver X or Y result, and then figure out the business value from that, and is it worth it? And that's where things like updating the data more frequently was obviously going to cost you more money. So if it's not giving you the instant value, you can back off, right, and start only updating every hour or once a day, or you can move that around pretty easily with Snowflake's infinite scalability, and kind of dial in that ROI for your specific use case.
And that's something I think like data consumers are like myself are really guilty of, right? Anytime like someone from the data team comes and asks me, oh, how often do you want the data? I'm going to say live immediately, every second. And so like there's that part with data teams where we got to push back a little bit and really kind of work with the business team to understand that business value and optimize those costs. Jesse, is there anything you'd kind of add to this? Why this is such a challenge, or some ways you've seen teams?
Well, yeah, I definitely, I resonate with kind of this idea of like looking at these pipelines, and that's definitely something that's starting to kind of swell in the data space, because these talks around like creating data products or creating data contracts in place, like these things are kind of really, getting a lot of traction in the data space today, and I'd have to say, like, I think people are taking a lot closer look at what their data is doing, and defining it as a product, and that product then has a cost that's associated with it, and it's got owners, and it needs to have it needs to have a contract in place of how it's being updated. Because if you're being charged for something, if you're having to spend money on moving data and compute for that, you want to make sure it's accurate. So kind of these things go in hand. I think as we're starting to get more data and we're starting to look at the costs, we're starting to put things like data product, calling it a data product, treating it as a product, and just trying to get it more accurate as a whole. So these things, though not all directly related, are kind of seeming to swell around this more focus on costs and movement of data as we kind of use these elastic services, put more data through them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like Snowflake and Monte Carlo both help data teams like go from that amorphous blob of data to that more focused use case, that more focused data product thinking, where it's always tied to that business value. All right, so I mean, like, let's get into it directly. Like, so how have you guys seen data teams really tackle this challenge of data cost optimization? Like, what are some of the main hurdles when getting started? Maybe Scott, you want to pick that one first.
Yeah, I think the biggest obstacle is usually an observation and basically observation and accountability problem, right? One, you have to observe what your costs are. Even in Snowflake, costs can be all over the board. You don't know which data team is using what data unless you drill down to the cost level at a cost per query level. And then the accountability piece, right? A lot of developers, I always interact with developers and, have a pipeline that's taking really long to run, or it's needs some optimization in the SQL to get it to be more performant, things like that. And you always get pushback from developers saying, I don't have the time, I don't have the resources to worry about SQL optimization. It's running fine. It's not breaking an SLA or SLO. So let's just keep it running, right? And then meanwhile, later on, your budgets are going overboard, or you don't have a budget, and until you start setting a budget, then you'll see how much that is actually costing you. And then you need somebody accountable on that team to be able to hold developers accountable and prioritize optimization in a lot of cases, because it is continual, right? I mean, data is changing. You're loading tons of data every day. Your data is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So over time, your pipelines can get more expensive or less expensive depending on your optimization techniques. So it is a continuous feedback loop that you need to have. It's not just a one and done kind of thing, which I've done in the past, optimized and everybody forgets about it. Once you optimize and get under budget, everybody forgets about it and like moves on with their world. And then all of a sudden, like 6 months later, you're like way over budget and everybody's freaking out again. It's always this continuous loop of hair on fire every 6 months to like try to get back into the under budget. So
yeah, I mean, we've heard of tech debt, right? And this is almost kind of in a similar way, pipeline debt. You have a really efficient platform, but you're moving fast, you're building stuff, and even the small inefficiencies over time, when there's a lot, it can build up. And so it's that matter of like that continuous improvement that I think you mentioned, Scott. That's a really good takeaway. Jesse, like, we often think about optimization from a cost perspective, but sometimes that can be a little limiting. Like, what are some of the benefits and perspectives that data teams should really like be taking when it comes to just warehouse optimization beyond cost?
So warehouse optimization beyond cost, I mean, it does in many ways kind of all tie back into cost. I mean, cost is our unit of kind of our compute or storage, all those kind of things. So if we look at cost, but we need to go that level deeper. What is actually driving that? And that's something we hear a lot from customers trying to get into that next level. I mean, like Scott was saying, like really get to that level of observability on the per query level, the per cost of the actual queries that are being run. That's something we hear a lot of, just wanting to see that level. And not only wanting to see the queries that are running to drive that cost, but what are they connected to? What outcome is being driven by that query? What data product is being produced by that query? And kind of tracking that all the way through the lineage, the multiple steps of perhaps data transformation, all the way to kind of whatever outcome, again, you're trying to drive with that. And so, I kind of, we see a lot of trying to trace that and have full traceability through the data infrastructure to kind of get those answers of what's driving and what's underlying that cost. And I love what Scott said there too, is that this is not a once a year activity where you just put it in and try to get below the budget, but it's actually a continuous thing. It's kind of constantly having monitors in place, constantly trying to make sure that you're not kind of exceeding those limits, and that if something is starting to kind of creep up, you proactively kind of head it off much sooner than it being a hair on fire kind of scenario.
Yeah, so maybe let's double click on that for a second. We're talking about this as a continuous process. Like Scott, from a process perspective, what do you see be successful? Is this, a role? Is there someone who's going to be, the head cost optimization person? Is this like the dev teams that are close to the data are best to account for this? Or from a process perspective, what are the best ways you've seen kind of teams organize around this idea?
Yeah, I think the best approach, we usually call it to build what's called a Snowflake COE, or Center of Excellence, inside of an organization, where you have maybe kind of a hub and spoke model, because it does get to be a lot. The bigger your data teams are, the more data you're running, the harder it is to manage that much stuff. So kind of building a COE across different data teams is a lot easier than having a single person that has responsibility for something. So pulling in like your lead data engineers for each of the different business units, or inside of IT, and maybe some of the accounting teams or budgeting teams as well, and having this center of excellence, and kind of keeping a maybe not weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly calendar invite on a calendar to get everybody together to look at the budget, kind of see what's going on, et cetera. The other thing we have seen is using a new feature in account usage views and query history. You have something called query parameterized hash now. So it's an automatically hashed. We hash the SQL text of a query and take out the parameters, so you can more easily detect a pipeline over time through weeks or days or months, and start to use anomaly detection over that. Sometimes pipelines, a lot of data will jump in, something may change, your cost may go up, your run times may go up depending on what's running at the time. So kind of tracking critical pipelines or expensive pipelines using query parameterized hash is very beneficial from that continuous feedback loop to track anomalies, because you kind of get in the dashboard where it's just, you're sick of looking at a dashboard, right, every day. So more around, you want to alert on problems, not just look at something every day. Right? You kind of get immune to seeing it over and over and over again. But if you do have some detection mechanism through kind of data observability, through anomaly detection, it's much better to actually be able to take action on it at the time of the problem.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying there, Scott, and detection is so important. And then the other thing to that, I think, is maybe a long running query isn't necessarily a bad query, and so maybe there's a little bit of like, well, how do you figure out and troubleshoot the next step, right? You have some level of detection. Well, then how do you like get the framework to optimize? And that is probably just about as good a segue as any into maybe how Monte Carlo is approaching this problem. Jesse, is there something would you like to show a little bit about performance, Monte Carlo's feature that kind of is
Yeah,
there?
definitely. And kind of leading into that, I'll kind of echo again what was said there, that this is really a journey of looking at a dashboard's great, but it's also, we want to be able to proactively monitor around these changes and kind of these queries, so we can proactively see these things. So that's something we've heard a lot, and we've gotten a lot of feedback to try to do that. And this is something that we've been able to kind of make some headway with in Monte Carlo. And I'll go through a little bit of a demo of how we are able to solve this and provide some of these insights to our customers. So I'll show what we have in Monte Carlo. We have this section called performance. And this is using kind of the same metadata that we are getting from Snowflake around query runtime and the costs that are associated with queries. And we build this UI in our product to kind of showcase this. So what I'm showing here in our performance tab is where we're able to see kind of all write queries that are coming through Snowflake. We're able to kind of collect those, we're able to kind of process them and graph out each one of the queries, and in this case, their runtime associated with each over a time basis. And the real benefit here is that I can start seeing some of these these jumps, and I can start seeing some of these jumps in the chart where I've got like a huge anomalous behavior from one of these queries that's been running. And if I wanted to dig in further into that, I could click further. I could maybe pare down and get a better insight of exactly what window I'm wanting to look at, or include or exclude stuff. But let's take as an example one of these big jumps in the chart here. And so I can look in Monte Carlo. I can see, all right, well, it looks like this user was associated with this table. And I can dig further into that simply by clicking at that point on our chart. And again, this gives us more details on that particular table at that particular point in time, that range that we're looking at. I can see the runtime. I can see the volume charts. I can see lots of other things that are kind of details around this particular query that I see that big spike on. And so if I wanted to kind of compare over a point in time too, I could compare two queries. If I wanted to see what changed in that query that maybe led to that spike, I could also choose two and compare, looking at kind of what was the difference between the cost per credit and the runtime between two. And that's just a really good way to kind of see this insight on this particular query and some of those jumps. Now, in many ways, since Snowflake is, great at doing some of this exact same stuff as well, one thing I mentioned at the beginning that Monte Carlo really tries to do is help you understand more about what is happening with this query, who's using it, and also what's the data quality around this particular table. So we see a spike, we want to ask a lot more questions. Who's using this data? Have there been any issues? Did someone make a change to this query in like a GitHub pull request that caused this big spike? And that really gets more into like really the bread and butter of Monte Carlo. So let's say I want to find out more about this table. Why did I have this spike? What happened? I can click into that table and we go deeper into Monte Carlo now, into this particular table where I'm able to see a lot more information around it. I can see kind of updates related to freshness, how often the data was updated. I can see volume information. I can see the query logs. And again, Monte Carlo is really focusing on helping you identify data quality incidents, whether that be a change in freshness or a change in volume or some skew in a particular field in that particular table, looking for all these different anomalous behaviors in the quality of the data. And so we're running these monitors, we're detecting these things, and we're giving you incidents. We're raising incidents that kind of tell you what happened around that table. In this particular example, I can see that I had an incident that Monte Carlo detected because a query didn't run, and some freshness data, basically the freshness of that table was potentially out of date. And so I'm getting all these insights from Monte Carlo of what was happening with this table, what are some changes that happened here. If I had some GitHub pull requests that were associated with that point in time, I could see those here. If I had any airflow changes, I can see those here. And I can kind of see a bigger picture of what was happening to that table that may have led to that spike in that performance. And just these general insights on this table as a whole. The second thing here is, again, trying to figure out who is using this table. Is it this big spike? Is it because a bunch of people or a bunch of reports were added? I can also see kind of the reports that are using this particular table. I can see these are all Looker reports that are downstream of this and are being used and engaged with. I can also see the full lineage of this table. If I see this big spike in the performance, all right, well, I can see, well, where did that come from? Did something upstream of this table also kind of expand in usage or change? And I can get this full picture of the lineage of the table and kind of where the data is coming from that may have led to that query spike. So these are all things that I can kind of get from Monte Carlo and keep on exploring this question more around, where did this change in performance come from? What led to this spike, and other things that can kind of help hone in on this cost optimization question that I've had.
That is so cool. And what I really appreciate about this approach is cost optimization is the simple thing where like X equals Y. There's so many different variables to take into account. So you have that single pane of glass. The other thing that's really interesting too, Jesse, I was thinking about is when you have a query that's not optimized, it's not always just a cost thing, but that has impacts to reliability or maybe how someone's experience the dashboard as well, right?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. So if a change in a query happens, if it's running longer or something happened there, I definitely want to know about, is that data that's using as a dashboard that's using that data, is it still reliable? Is it still something that I can trust? And if it's not trustworthy, how do I notify the people that are using it and consuming it that this data may, have a potential issue? And again, that really gets to the root of what Monte Carlo tries to solve, helping you detect those issues, detect and notify the stakeholders that this data may be not correct, it may be inoptimized, and it should be considered, not the right source until we've repaired that.
And Jesse, we actually got a really relevant question from the audience. Thank you for submitting. Is there a consolidated view of how the DBT model itself is spiked? DBT model usually has more than one write query. Is there that view, of that performance, that model execution? And I think, maybe you could show a little bit about
We
that.
do. So we do actually have a way that we can show that DBT model. Let me see if the best way to actually do this, we can perhaps dig into some of the innards of Monte Carlo a little bit more. I'm looking at all what Monte Carlo can see right now. So actually, let me take a look at some of the jobs that we have. These are some of the DBT jobs. Let's see if we can find one here. So within this DBT job in Monte Carlo, I can actually see the runtime of each of the queries. And this is that one DBT job. I can see the runtime of it, and I can see the runtime of each one of the queries. Again, this is provided by the performance section of Monte Carlo to kind of give you this runtime, the success rate here as well, and kind of the duration of this overall. So hopefully that answers the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really love that chart at the bottom too, because if you have some queries that are queuing up other queries, you have that Gantt chart at the bottom there that's going to highlight that and really show you how to optimize that. And I'm going to be honest, that was a real audience question. I feel like people are going to go, oh, that was a plant. No, that was actually a real audience question.
Those are the best.
Thank you to whoever queued that. Yeah, thank you to whoever queued that up. The check's in the mail. Cool. All right. So, Scott, going back to kind of more from a process perspective, many data teams haven't really had to scrutinize to the extent that they're being asked to now. For teams that are just starting to build this muscle, are there any tips for getting started, or are there quick wins out there that you'd recommend they look for first?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest, with DBT specifically, there is a DBT util package, I believe, that allows you to do query tagging. So this is a trick to make sure you're using JSON objects in your query tags. That allows you to kind of put stakeholder name, a bunch of key value pairs that you can parse out with a parse JSON, in Snowflake, to be able to group things together, group your model name together from within query history. I believe some of the other things you can do is what we see usually, you have a warehouse, right? And you have a bunch of queries running on that warehouse. What tends to happen, I would say, is the bigger queries start coming into that warehouse. And then instead of moving those queries to a new warehouse, to a bigger warehouse, the small, 5% of the total 100% of queries that need a bigger warehouse, move it over. People tend to upsize the warehouse that all the queries are running on, hoping that, all the queries running together are going to share the cost, so it'll be less. What I've seen over time, though, is you keep upping that warehouse, and you end up with 95% of your queries that be running on a very small warehouse and cost you way less credits per hour. So make sure warehouse optimization is a thing. Make sure you're not running a ton of small little queries on a very big warehouse and just keeping that warehouse on for no reason and not utilizing it appropriately is one of the biggest things I've seen. And then on that note, after the fact, you can start looking at warehouse consolidation, right? Over time, you tend to create more and more warehouses because it's so easy to create a warehouse. I'll create a warehouse for this person, that person, the other person, this team, that team. Then all of a sudden you have hundreds of warehouses that you're trying to manage, and each one is barely doing anything when queries come in. So watch out for that warehouse sprawl and start figuring out how to consolidate queries down to the warehouse, a single warehouse, to utilize that warehouse more appropriately.
Yeah, I love that about especially around that data warehouse optimization. I was reading about scaling up versus scaling out, and the way I understood it, maybe it's too simplistic, was scaling up is when you have those complex queries. Maybe they need a more complex warehouse. Maybe good to group those together. Scaling out, maybe adding more clusters for more queries concurrently. Is that too simplistic, or is that a way that folks should think about it?
Nope, that's exactly it. Yeah, scaling out on clusters using multi-cluster warehouses in Snowflake. So if you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of queries running, then scaling out is what you want for concurrency, so that more clusters spin up and can hold more and more concurrent queries. Versus if you have a very complex query or a query trying to crunch a bunch of billions and billions of rows of data, you want to scale up and get a bigger warehouse, from a small to a medium to a large, extra large, all the way up to a 6XL if you needed.
So this has kind of been really interesting. The other thing that comes to mind is, maybe there's potentially we've mainly been talking about consolidation and cutting, and is there a risk of being maybe a little too overeager with a hatchet instead of a scalpel? Maybe that long running query or workload, maybe it is important, or maybe it's commensurate to business value. So like, how do you identify those like really critical workloads, and what workloads maybe are more deserving of, or you see typically occupy more resources in a way that's okay, Scott?
Yeah, I think query tags are very beneficial there, as to tagging queries that are critical queries that you can parse on, right? And figure out, hey, these are expensive queries, but they're marked critical, right? They're a critical pipeline for a bunch of stuff, so that you can kind of either exclude those or keep them in their own little bucket of making sure, your anomalies on critical queries are not as much as your more or less critical queries. So I think that's the biggest benefit of query tags, and just observability in general, like using Monte Carlo tools like that for where you can observe the data more across the board, across Airflow, dbt, Snowflake, everywhere, kind of see that end-to-end flow on your critical work streams.
And it strikes me kind of like we were talking about earlier, those tagging is probably really helpful for associating different costs in different areas of the business use cases too. All right, so we've kind of been talking about best practices, but maybe let's move into a few real world examples. Scott, you've worked with a ton of Snowflake customers on these types of initiatives. I'd love to hear a story of where this was successful and why.
Yeah, I work on a ton of different customers across the board. Some of our largest customers, for sure. One of them I presented at Summit last year, so you guys can find some recordings around what we did at our customer Instacart. We've done some pretty big cost optimizations there, and like I said, a lot of it is more around accountability and just making people accountable for what they're spending. Is a lot of the problem. Once people are accountable, they start, making sure that they're doing the right thing for the company, right? And making sure they're not overspending just because they want to be lazy and build a pipeline and just let it go. And tech debt, kind of to your comment earlier, just accumulates and accumulates to where, there's tons of old queries that maybe aren't even being used anymore. That's one of the biggest ones, is like scheduling dashboards to run every day that I've seen across the board is figuring out, hey, is that dashboard used anymore? Because there's always this chasm between IT or even the data engineering teams within the business and the actual business. Like the business asks you to build this dashboard or this pipeline to support the data of this dashboard. So you have this pipeline running every hour on the hour, and then you ultimately find out that nobody's actually using it anymore, right? It's very common.
Doesn't matter how optimized the dashboard is if no one's used it in 2 years. It could be the most optimized, best running dashboard this world's ever seen. It's still, a wasteful cost. That makes a lot of sense. Jesse, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the kind of the performance features that I shared that Monte Carlo recently released and they're fairly recent, and we had a lot of really great customer feedback when we released that. A lot of questions on or a lot of feedback on, oh, wow, I had no idea that these queries are running like this, or wow, I had no idea that this thing was underutilized and I could remove all this stuff. And so when we really brought this new area of Monte Carlo to our customers, is that it really created a lot of visibility that I think was not there before. Mainly because these data engineers or these analysts are kind of heads down, making sure that the data is working, but not necessarily always thinking about, all right, well, what is this cost being associated? And that's definitely, as Scott was kind of mentioning, it's a problem that needs to kind of have ownership on it. It needs to go to the individuals that are working with the data, not just like the one person that's holding the staff to try to make sure that everyone stays optimized. So with a lot of the learnings that we had as we rolled out our performance features, that it brought visibility where there was previously none. Just there was not a lot of visibility on kind of what these things were, what the queries were doing. And with that, we heard a lot of people, making some changes in the queries, seeing these spikes and actually changing their pipelines and how things were running, optimizing across the board. And with those as well, kind of the thing that we also have in Monte Carlo is letting you to set up continuous monitors on that performance as well. So it was great to see people optimize and kind of use that dashboard, the dashboard we showed, to kind of get to those levels that they thought were more tenable, but then also to set up some monitors to basically continuously notify them of spikes in the future or things that actually were anomalous behavior and kind of the performance of those queries. So really two parts, like bringing that visibility to an organization was a huge benefit across the board, and just getting it into the hands of the users that should own kind of the cost of their queries and kind of bringing that accountability to them. And then two, making sure that they felt ongoing accountability and an ongoing kind of sense of owning any sort of anomalous behavior around these queries or spikes in performance as well. So those were kind of two big things that we saw a lot of change in as we kind of brought this performance section of Monte Carlo to the customers.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you guys say, visibility, observability, accountability, transparency, all these things so vital to these things. This reminds me of a blog we published. We asked 7 data leaders about their cost optimization tips. They had a lot of great, very specific technical items, but the biggest repeated thing that they all mentioned was talk to the business. Business value comes from the business. There's no magic bullet. Business value is what the business says it is. So I'm just kind of curious, Scott and Jesse, maybe Scott, starting with you, what are some tips for how you can communicate cost optimization initiatives, or some of these things? How can you best communicate with maybe non-technical users or business leaders? Like, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I think that's where that COE concept comes in. If you can create that at your companies, as building, a group of people that understand, even if not technically understand, but in the business understand what your data engineers are doing and how it works. Like, yeah, the biggest conversation you have is, hey, data engineer, I love to update my data, like real-time streaming. That's the coolest thing ever, right? But talking to your business user, and even if you talk to your business user, they would tend to say, yeah, I'd love to have my data like instantaneously so I can look at it and make decisions on it. But the difference is asking them, can you actually action something every 5 minutes if I was to update that data? Because it does actually cost you more money, right? And in a consumption model, things cost more money to do continuous streaming. That's some of the biggest questions I've seen is, even when IT says the business told me so, it's not really, you're talking 2 different languages. So just make sure you're all on the same page when you're talking about, business value from that perspective.
Perfect. Jesse, anything you would add?
Yeah, I definitely kind of like what you said there, Scott. It's like, yeah, I could have a real-time pipeline. Everything could be instantaneously updated, but can I use the insights I gather from that to actually change things on that real-time basis? So we all want instant gratification of like, I want to know the answer now. But it really does take that conversation of, all right, well, can I use that real-time answer to change anything in the moment? And maybe the answer is yes. In some cases, it is actually worth the cost to actually stream that data or make sure it is real-time. But that is an important conversation to have. Can I action this data in a real-time way? Or is it good enough to have it updated every 24 hours or every 6 or 4? And I think again, kind of bringing the visibility to that, who's using the data, who are the users on it, how often these dashboards are updated, are kind of all questions that come into this conversation when you're looking at cost optimization. Again, using an example we've seen inside of Monte Carlo, a user told us they saw a big, a spike, or they saw a query that was creeping up in kind of cost over time, and that cost was pretty significant. It was a pretty high cost, and they had to ask the question like, all right, well, is this cost worth it? And to answer that question, they looked at the query, they traced it to basically what dashboards that it was, or the data was being put into, what tables, and then traced that to what dashboards were actually using that, and went to those users and asked the question, okay, do you need this data updated every 4 hours, because it's a pretty heavy query that we're having to run? And out of that, kind of we're able to gain the insights. No, they look at this maybe once a week. So updating that data every 4 hours is really kind of pointless. So with that, being able to dial back that and change those kind of intervals that query was run to a lower interval to optimize the cost, but still give the business the insights that they needed and give those key users kind of the updated information they needed, that was pretty important. And they simply were able to use that money saved to run some other queries that they did need at a higher interval because the dashboard were looked at more often. So it's all about kind of shifting that cost from places that it's perhaps not needed as much to action on, in the time that it's used, to places that it is more readily needed because, those insights are more actionable.
Yeah, that's the key with Snowflake. I think you asked earlier, like, why is Snowflake so obsessed about cost optimization, optimizing on Snowflake? That's the point, right? We want you to be able to do the best you can, be able to save money somewhere to actually do a use case that you need to do, right? So we are heavily focused on optimization and new features coming out around how to do optimization and stuff like that. So we want you to be using Snowflake consumption for useful business purposes. We focus on talking to the business and getting business value out of Snowflake, not just what's the coolest tech thing you can do right now just to be techie and spend money with no business value.
Everyone feels a little bit better when your money can go farther to do more things that really, bring that value. So
Yeah, I think we should probably also mention that performance, that's possible to pre-build integrations across a lot of modern data stack, but particularly Snowflake Data Cloud. So we're really kind of proud to be part of that Snowflake Horizon partner ecosystem, and it's a lot of hooks that allow us to do some of these things and extend a lot of that value. All right, a little bit of a technical question here, and I'm not sure I actually know the answer, or so apologies if this is a little bit of a silly question. But oftentimes when you see the topic of cost optimization come up, you see table partitioning or clustering right next to it. So Scott, I'm kind of curious how Snowflake approaches that.
That is a foundational concept you need to understand in Snowflake to make sure that you are optimizing your reads of tables, is how you're partitioned and how you're clustered, how your tables are partitioned, how they're clustered. How you're inserting data into a table in your pipelines is how that data is partitioned on the fly, right? And if it's being inserted in random order, then you're trying to query that table against a specific date set or a where clause. You're going to spend a lot of time churning through table scans, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. That is definitely an optimization technique that people need to understand is the way you insert data in is the way it's partitioned. If you cannot insert the data into a table in an ordered fashion, tends to be like dimensional models where you're updating products randomly throughout the day. There's no real order. You would use something like auto clustering to be able to keep that data in order. After you make the update, then auto clustering can kick in and resort that data in a fashion that you can read from it more effectively. So it's a key concept to understand.
Great. Okay. So it wasn't a silly question. All right, maybe let's go into some takeaways, right? So maybe what I'll start with is maybe a key technical takeaway. If people could take away with like one best technical tip they could take from this conversation, what would it be? Then maybe go into process, and then from a solutions perspective, right? So maybe just starting with technical takeaway, Scott, then maybe Jesse, like what is the one technical takeaway above all else that you want people to walk away from this webinar with?
Using account usage, the data we provide in Snowflake to make good decisions about your optimization. There's lots of blog posts out there. There's lots of from Monte Carlo, from Snowflake employees, from our customers on how to use the account usage views to make good decisions about like what's being optimized and what's not optimized. I think that's the biggest key from that side. I think the process side, again, accountability, creating budgets. One thing that usually happens is, well, I don't have a budget. Well, yeah, you do. If you're using Snowflake, why not just use your current usage to kind of back into a budget so at least you have a starting point, right? I think from the process perspective, I've seen that's the biggest thing because you get churn like, oh, well, how much budget do I give to accounting? How much do I give to finance? Well, let's first think about it as, how much usage am I using right now and back into a budget and then at least stay within that budget and then understand who's using. If you do start going over that budget, understand why, and maybe, a business unit, your customers are growing, everything's great at your company, and you use more usage to do better things, to get more customers, to sell more products, then you can up those budgets. But always kind of start with something, just back into a budget, I think is a key concept I've learned over the years working with multiple customers.
Love that, Scott. Jesse, what would you have our audience take away?
Yeah, I love what Scott mentioned there of backing into a budget and kind of in part to back into that budget and then to start making changes within that budget or optimizing within that budget. Definitely using the tools that Snowflake provides. And then again, on the Monte Carlo side, trying to answer some of those questions. If I'm trying to move cost or really kind of optimize, are the tables being used? Are the databases or the dashboards that are built on top of these, are they being used? And really trying to answer a lot of those questions and using kind of the tools that Monte Carlo provides to be able to kind of answer those questions and see if those queries are properly optimized or if that money could be saved and moved somewhere else. So the key takeaway I would say is really just kind of make sure you understand how that current cost is being used and where can you shift things and kind of move to kind of better optimize how that money is being spent.
Guys, I'm going to come in because we're getting close to the end of the program, and I did want to make sure we got to a couple of housekeeping things. Part of the housekeeping for me is to point out for everybody watching that they can download a couple of guides, one from Monte Carlo, the Snowflake cost optimization guide, and there's a tiny URL there that you can grab and go get. And we also have one on the Snowflake side as well, which is a cost and performance optimization guide. And we would encourage you to download those. And that was really where I was getting to, because I did while you guys were talking. I went and downloaded the Monte Carlo one. And it's very comprehensive and very well designed. Kudos to the marketing department for the layout and it's comprehensive. But I think it's fascinating. So I think this whole topic is fascinating because I'm old enough to remember when getting people to move to the cloud was the problem. and now the problem is maybe they're using the cloud a little too recklessly with regard to thinking that it's I know one of the selling points of moving to the cloud was that it was going to reduce costs, and yet there's always implication to every decision, and I think this is fascinating. But I'm curious to get your opinions, because there is one here, a section in one of the guides around how cloud warehouse costs get out of hand, and I know you guys touched on some points, but I'm curious where you see in the organization that people begin to become responsible for this. So I get the idea that everybody's kind of saying, well, we just need these queries, and and they're making a lot of requests and maybe not even using the things that were built around those requests as efficiently as they could. But I'm curious where you find where can an organization think about this sort of thing? I guess is what I'm getting to. Who in the organization should be thinking about this, and where should they be looking? And who should they be collaborating with to look at these concerns?
I'll just mention really quickly from my perspective too. Like I feel like it's always a pendulum, right? Moving from on-prem to something like the Snowflake Data Cloud, you can do things you couldn't even do on-prem, right? So you have all this extra capacity, and data teams and the business eventually they find ways to use it, right? A lot of those things we're doing with machine learning, Gen AI, all of these things are adding so much business value weren't even possible, right? And so as we build up extra capacity, we find ways to use it. And so it's always kind of that pendulum of additional capacity, more value, and then optimizing to that value. So that's kind of the perspective I've kind of seen. Scott, Jesse, I don't know what you would say to Doug's question there.
Again, back to COEs, it is key having understanding not only between IT and a business unit, but multiple business units in your organization and IT and a hub and spoke model. What's finance doing that marketing wants to do? Maybe there's a use case, connect the two together. Just having that center of excellence of people between different business units with different perspectives to understand how people are using the data. What are your use cases? What are my use cases? And understanding, where business value can be extracted from all the tons and tons of data every company has.
Yeah, and I'd kind of add, moving from the on-prem world to the cloud. I mean, you used to do the annual allocation, and you had all this space, and you felt like you weren't using it unless you filled up all that space. So the mindset was like, okay, we can put a lot in there, and we can kind of use and fully our optimization is kind of filling up the space that we've used or kind of purchased, but. And that mindset really shifts when we move to the cloud world. Like it's no longer like, okay, well, let's just fill up everything we can, but the stuff that we are putting there, let's make sure it is of value to us. So that is definitely a mindset shift for organizations kind of going through that transition process to kind of move from the, anything goes to now thinking, okay, well, I have all this elasticity, but with great power comes that great responsibility of making sure that the things that I am deploying are of strong value. So keep creating those stakeholders, kind of the stakeholders that, as Scott mentioned there, but just making sure that the teams are having those practices in place with your teams, that if something is there, if it is running, that it is serving kind of that purpose, and you don't leave these kind of ends of the strings not tied. I think that's a big part of kind of establishing that culture within an organization as this transition happens.
And Snowflake has a lot of these guardrails, right? Like auto suspend, auto timeout. So like take a look at those guardrails and see how those are working for you.
Yeah, and it is incredibly useful to download guides like this, and I don't. I always want to emphasize that point. And it's also incredibly useful to engage. And I want to emphasize that point as well, because I think sometimes people, think they've got a handle on it, and maybe even by attending something like this, they get a sense for being able to sort through it internally. But honestly, engaging is one of the great ways to really double check your work and to talk to experts like the folks we have on this panel today is also a great use of your time, because they have all kinds of specific instances that are relevant to your particular situation, most assuredly. Both these organizations have amazing amounts of implementations and all kinds of case studies and use cases. So we would always encourage folks to engage. But I'm curious to get your final thoughts with regard to advice. And I know you've provided a little bit of advice, a fair amount of advice, but some final advice as people start to plan out their 2024, start to think about, the other things on the horizon. In addition to starting to take a measure of cost optimization, I mean, what else should they be thinking about with regard to their cloud implementations?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff coming, new features, Snowpark Container Services. There's a lot of AI, Gen AI stuff. You can use Snowpark optimized warehouses now. So it's not getting easier. There's a lot more complexities coming that can add to your overall usage of Snowflake. So getting a foundational setup of how to budget, how to optimize, how to monitor your stuff right now is key because there's tons of stuff coming down the line that'll make it even harder. So be prepared.
Yeah, and I'd kind of say that 2024 is going to be this year, as we know, of kind of this further Gen AI boom, where everyone wants to, kind of compete in this race to get something out there, to use Gen AI to do all sorts of things. And with that kind of big push is going to be a lot of data. People are going to be putting data in a lot of places, maybe duplicating that data at kind of the sake of trying to move quick and kind of beat the others to the market to kind of lead in the sector. But establishing those practices, making sure that you don't leave it kind of unended and kind of open is going to be really important. Otherwise, you're going to get to the end of 2024 and realize, what have we done? We've created a mess. So it's really important to kind of keep track of those things as the organization kind of tries to stay in this rapid pace with the evolving technical changes too. So that's my advice.
And what I would add is just like it doesn't matter how well you optimize a dashboard that's never used, it doesn't matter how well you optimize something if the data's bad, right? So all of these use cases, Gen AI, your dashboards, your machine learning models, they all require quality data. So really making sure you get on top of that is key as well.
Yeah, guys, this has been great. Again, I think points well made with regard to why you want to engage and have conversations with professionals like this. That they've seen a thing or two, they know what's coming, and it's an amazing time to be in IT, and there's a lot happening. We certainly cover a lot of it here at Solutions Review. We certainly cover Snowflake and Monte Carlo aggressively, and if you want to read anything that we're writing about, we would encourage you to come to solutionsreview.com and check out all that we have for you there. This has been tremendously valuable, and we very much appreciate the time. It's going to be a great year. Very, very excited for it. Best of luck to all of you. And again, thanks very much for the time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Another solution in our spotlight. We want to thank Michael and Jesse from Monte Carlo and Scott from Snowflake for that fine presentation. And we appreciate your attendance as well. Until next time, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review. Thanks for watching.